He was the victor of Custozza, the last great general of a dying empire, the only man with the genius to save the Habsburg dynasty from itself. He was celebrated as a hero, a savior, the heir to a legendary military legacy, and for this, he was rewarded with suspicion, relegated to the shadows, and politically crushed by the one man he was bound to serve. His name? Archduke Albrecht. How could the man who held the empire's salvation in his hands be treated as its greatest threat? How did his loyalty become a liability and his genius a crime? Albrecht was Habsburg royalty through and through, born in 1817 as the grandson of Emperor Leopold II. But his true inheritance, the one that would define his life and seal his fate, came from his father, the legendary Archduke Charles. Charles was more than just a prince. He was a living icon, the victor of Aspern, the only general to have decisively defeated Napoleon himself in a major pitched battle. To be the son of such a man was to be born with an impossibly heavy mantle. From his earliest days, Albrecht was not just another archduke destined for ceremonial duties. He was the heir to a sacred military legacy, a born leader groomed for the battlefield. The central tragedy of his life, therefore, was not a lack of opportunity or a deficiency of talent. He possessed both in abundance. His tragedy was that this unparalleled tactical brilliance, this genetic inheritance of command, collided head-on with the cold, unyielding wall of imperial suspicion. His entire existence would be defined by this agonizing conflict, a life of immense unfulfilled potential, a career of suppressed ambition, all lived out under the long, suffocating shadow of his cousin, Emperor Franz Joseph. The mechanism of his downfall was a poison unique to royal families, a toxic blend of feigned loyalty and corrosive, deep-seated envy. It wasn't a single, dramatic betrayal, but a slow, creeping marginalization. Albrecht's early successes, his undeniable competence, his natural charisma with the troops, these were not celebrated as assets to the crown. Instead, they were viewed through the warped lens of a young, insecure emperor. Franz Joseph, who ascended the throne in the chaotic fires of 1848 at the tender age of 18, saw in his capable cousin not a pillar of support, but a potential rival, a man whose popularity and influence could one day eclipse his own. A would-be ally was reframed as a threat, and a life of being perpetually sidelined began. That tragic conflict was inevitable. Albrecht was crushed between two worlds that could never be reconciled: the world of modern meritocratic warfare he embodied, and the stagnant paranoid dynasty he was born to serve. The Habsburg Empire that Albrecht was born into was not a confident, thriving modern power. It was an oppressive, restrictive, and deeply fragile entity, a gilded cage rattling from the aftershocks of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. This was an empire built on the principle of not changing, an empire defined by its paralyzing fear of the future. Albrecht grew up under the rigid absolutism of his uncle, Emperor Francis I, and later the almost farcically incompetent Ferdinand I. This was an era dominated by bureaucratic stagnation, a suffocating conservatism, where reform was considered a dirty word, synonymous with treason. The court in Vienna was a collection of aging aristocrats and time-serving functionaries who prioritized the dusty, arcane traditions of the Spanish court protocol over military innovation, economic development, or political reality. The dominant force for decades was Prince Clemens von Metternich, the empire's chancellor, whose entire political system was a reactionary crusade against the 19th century itself. Metternich's Europe was a house of cards, and he spent his life trying to forbid any breeze. He used a vast network of secret police and draconian censors to stamp out any spark of dissent, any call for constitutional government, any flicker of ethnic identity among the empire's myriad peoples. It was an empire holding its breath, desperately trying to pretend the world was not moving on. But the world was moving on, and the threats were closing in from all sides, pressing against the empire's brittle borders. Externally, the genie of nationalism, violently uncorked by Napoleon, could not be put back in the bottle. In Italy, which Austria dominated, figures like Giuseppe Mazzini and Giuseppe Garibaldi were fanning the flames of Risorgimento, the dream of a unified Italian state free from the Austrian boot. To the north, Prussia, with its disciplined army, burgeoning industry, and ruthless political will, was methodically working to supplant Austria as the dominant power among the German states. The revolutionary uprisings that swept Europe in the Springtime of Peoples in 1848 were a terrifying confirmation of all the court's worst fears, setting Vienna itself ablaze and forcing the royal family to flee. But the external threats were matched, if not surpassed, by the internal ones. The Habsburg Empire was not a nation. It was a multinational prison of peoples. Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, Slovaks, Romanians, Serbs, and Slovenes were all bound together not by a shared identity, but only by their shared and often reluctant allegiance to a distant emperor in Vienna. This ethnic tinderbox was simmering, ready to explode at the slightest provocation. Compounding this, the empire's economy was backwards, its finances were a disorganized mess, and its military, which had once faced down Napoleon, was now dangerously outdated, relying on tactics and equipment from a bygone era. The loss of territories and prestige in the decades after Napoleon wasn't just a political setback. It was a symptom of a deep systemic rot. The chaos of 1848 exposed the utter bankruptcy of this old system. Emperor Ferdinand I, feeble-minded and incapable of coherent thought, was a hopeless figurehead. His abdication in favor of his 18-year-old nephew, Franz Joseph, was a desperate last-ditch gamble to save the dynasty. The empire was literally on fire, and it screamed for dynamic, competent leadership. And there, waiting in the wings, was Archduke Albrecht. He was everything the old guard was not. Trained in the military arts from the age of 13, he was a serious student of modern warfare, a man who understood logistics, strategy, and the morale of the common soldier. He was the new blood, the living embodiment of his father's heroic legacy, the one man who could potentially drag the antiquated Habsburg army into the 19th century and forge it into a force capable of holding the fragmenting empire together. He was, in short, the answer, but in a system built on paranoia, the answer looked suspiciously like a problem. The Habsburgs had a long, dark history of internal family rivalries, of brothers betraying brothers and cousins plotting against cousins. The idea of a talented, popular, and ambitious archduke commanding the personal loyalties of a newly reformed army was, to the new untested emperor and his advisors, a nightmare scenario. They desperately needed Albrecht's talent to survive the immediate crises, but they feared that very talent would be their undoing in the long run. And so from the very beginning of Franz Joseph's reign, Albrecht was kept in check, his potential a closely guarded and deeply feared commodity, setting the stage for a lifetime of tragic conflict. In stark, almost defiant contrast to this world of stagnant tradition and reactionary fear, Archduke Albrecht emerged as a force of unsettling modernity. He was the absolute antithesis of the old guard, a man forged not in the perfumed salons of the Hofburg Palace, but in the harsh, unforgiving crucibles of military theory, and eventually the battlefield itself. While the courtiers and politicians of Vienna were defined by their ceremonial roles, their indecisiveness masked by layers of bureaucratic protocol, Albrecht was a man of cold, hard, pragmatic action. His personality was not one of easy charm. He was often described as stern, reserved, profoundly serious, and even ruthlessly efficient. This was not the aloofness of an aristocrat, but the intense, unblinking focus of a professional who saw a catastrophic failure in progress and knew with mathematical certainty that the entire imperial structure was at risk. He didn't just play at being a soldier, he was one, through and through. He studied logistics while others debated heraldry. He analyzed artillery trajectories while others practiced their waltzes. This fundamental, almost abrasive difference in character made him a true mold breaker. He valued substance over appearance, competence over bloodline, a philosophy that was, in itself, a revolutionary act within the Habsburg system. This modern military mind was not innate, it was meticulously sculpted. Albrecht's true education came at the hands of a living legend, the man who represented the very best of the old, tenacious Austrian army, Field Marshal Joseph Radetzky. While other archdukes were given tutors who taught them courtly manners and languages, Albrecht was, in effect, apprenticed to the hero of the Italian campaigns. From Radetzky he learned lessons that simply could not be found in Viennese textbooks. He learned that modern wars were not won by static lines of brightly dressed men, marching politely into cannon fire. They were won by speed, by maneuver, by surprising the enemy, by understanding the terrain, and, most critically, by inspiring a ferocious personal loyalty in the common soldier. Radetzky was a master of morale, a father to his troops, and he imbued in Albrecht the understanding that an army's spirit was its most potent weapon. Albrecht absorbed these principles completely. He began to synthesize the unshakable Habsburg tradition of duty and loyalty with an innovative, almost Prussian, command philosophy. He became a living symbol of renewal, a walking embodiment of what the army could be. But this very competence was a double-edged sword. It made him an icon to the forward-thinking officers, but a deep structural threat to the aristocratic amateurs who held power through birthright alone, and who, quite correctly, sensed that Albrecht's vision had no place for them. The 1848 revolutions were the baptism by fire that separated Albrecht from every other archduke of his generation. While the imperial family fled Vienna in panic and the empire itself seemed to be dissolving, Albrecht was on the front lines in Italy, serving directly under his mentor, Radetzky. He wasn't a distant commander, protected far behind the lines. He was in the thick of the fighting, distinguishing himself in the brutal combat at Santa Lucia, where he led his brigade with a cold, clear-headed courage. He tasted gunpowder, he saw the chaos of a broken line, and he learned the brutal calculus of combat firsthand. This experience was transformative. It gave him an unshakable battlefield legitimacy, a gravitas that no ceremonial title could ever bestow. He had held the line while the throne itself teetered. This authority, earned in blood, was independent of his royal birth, and in an absolute monarchy, any source of independent authority is dangerous. He returned from the campaigns of 1848 not as just another prince, but as a proven warrior hero, a man the army had seen bleed and triumph. This reputation would follow him for the rest of his life, a halo of glory that, in the eyes of his cousin, would look increasingly like the glint of a rival's crown. His experiences in 1848 and 1849 did not just earn him medals. They burned into him a clear, urgent, and unshakable vision. He had seen firsthand the catastrophic failings of the Habsburg military. It was slow, technologically backward, poorly supplied, and led by a patchwork of incompetent nobles who had bought their commissions. He knew with an almost religious certainty that unless this rotten structure was torn down and rebuilt, the empire was doomed. His vision was for the Habsburg court shockingly radical. He wanted to completely professionalize the Austrian army. He envisioned a force built on merit, not aristocracy. He advocated for a modern general staff, standardized training, rapid adoption of new technology like the breech-loading rifle, and a logistics system that could actually supply an army in the field. This was a direct existential challenge to the centuries-old system of aristocratic privilege. He wasn't just trying to update the army, he was trying to drag it, kicking and screaming into the 19th century. This quest for modernization became his life's work, a mission that would win him powerful allies and even more powerful enemies. A man with such a revolutionary vision could not operate alone. He began methodically to build his own power base. This network, which his detractors and paranoid courtiers came to call his shadow court, was not composed of the usual political schemers or fawning aristocrats. It was a fraternity of like-minded professionals, officers who had served with him under Radetzky in Italy, artillery experts who understood the changing face of warfare, engineers and logisticians who were frustrated by the court's incompetence. These were Albrecht's men. They were drawn to his cold decisiveness, his deep technical knowledge, and his utter lack of pretense. In him, they saw a leader who actually understood their trade, a stark contrast to the distant, paperwork-obsessed emperor in Vienna. This created a parallel power structure within the military, a professional corps bound by personal loyalty to Albrecht and his vision of a reborn, invincible army. To Franz Joseph, this looked dangerously like a private army, a state within a state loyal to a potential rival. Albrecht's influence was not confined to military matters. In 1851, after the brutal suppression of the Hungarian Revolution, the shattered kingdom of Hungary needed a governor to enforce imperial will. Franz Joseph gave this incredibly sensitive and difficult job to Albrecht. It was a test of his loyalty and his administrative skill. Albrecht descended on Hungary with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to the battlefield. For the next 9 years, he was the military and civil governor, the iron fist of Viennese absolutism. He implemented a policy of harsh centralization, systematically dismantling Hungary's ancient constitution, abolishing local self-government, and imposing German as the language of administration. He oversaw military tribunals and a vast network of police and spies to crush any lingering spark of rebellion. From the Habsburg perspective, his governorship was a stunning success. He had pacified the rebellious kingdom and proven he was a brutally effective administrator. But to the Hungarians, he became a symbol of their oppression, a tyrant who had snuffed out their national identity. This period, while proving his administrative skill, also cemented his political reputation. He was an unbending centralist, a man who believed the empire's only hope for survival was to crush all ethnic nationalism and forge a single, unified, German-speaking state. This rigid, uncompromising political stance would later put him in direct opposition to the very compromises his emperor would be forced to make. And then there was the foil. To understand Albrecht's tragedy, one must understand the man who would cast the shadow, Emperor Franz Joseph I. When Franz Joseph ascended the throne in 1848 at the age of 18, he was not a conqueror or a genius. He was a teenager, handed a collapsing empire because his uncle was an imbecile and his father was too weak to rule. He was a creature of the Habsburg, a man defined by duty, protocol, and an almost pathological obsession with paperwork. He was, at his core, the empire's chief bureaucrat. While Albrecht was learning the art of maneuver from Radetzky, Franz Joseph was learning the art of cautious reactionary absolutism from his mother, the formidable Archduchess Sophie, and the Metternich-era advisors who surrounded him. His primary instinct, burned into him by the fires of 1848, was not innovation, but preservation. He wanted, above all, to stop the clock, to hold the line, to survive. He was a man of the past, desperately trying to rule in the present. And crucially, he lacked the one thing his cousin Albrecht had in abundance: battlefield legitimacy. This psychological chasm between the two men was violently exposed in 1859 during the Second Italian War of Independence. Against the advice of his more experienced generals, Franz Joseph decided to take personal command of the army in the field. The result was the catastrophic, bloody Battle of Solferino. It was an unmitigated disaster. Franz Joseph, completely outmaneuvered by the French and their Italian allies, proved to be an indecisive and incompetent commander. The battle was a horrific slaughter that so traumatized a Swiss observer, Henri Dunant, that it led him to found the Red Cross. But for Franz Joseph, it was a profound personal and public humiliation. He was forced to cede the rich province of Lombardy to the Italians. He had led the army in person and he had failed. He retreated to Vienna a broken man, vowing never to command an army in battle again. Now place this man, the humiliated emperor, back in the same palace as Archduke Albrecht, the son of a legend, the hero of 1848, the man the army genuinely respected as a brilliant tactician. The dynamic became toxic. Albrecht's mere existence was a constant, silent rebuke to Franz Joseph's authority. Every cheer from a regiment for Albrecht, every article praising his military acumen, was a grain of salt rubbed into the open wound of Solferino. This is the dark psychological engine of our story. Franz Joseph, deeply insecure about his own military failings, began to see his cousin's competence not as an asset, but as a direct and personal threat. He looked at Albrecht's shadow court of professional officers and saw not a general staff, but a cabal. He heard the troops' genuine affection for Albrecht and heard the whispers of a potential coup. He was haunted by the classic paranoid's question. In the next great crisis, if the army was forced to choose between the incompetent emperor who lost at Solferino and the brilliant Archduke who triumphed in Italy, where would their loyalties lie? This created an impossible unspoken rivalry. On the surface, court protocol was strictly, almost rigidly, observed. Albrecht was, by all accounts, unfailingly loyal in his public duty, and Franz Joseph was always correct and formal in his treatment of his high-ranking cousin. But beneath this thin, fragile veneer of familial loyalty, a deep and corrosive jealousy was festering. Franz Joseph's all-too-human insecurity was turning the empire's single greatest military asset into a perceived enemy. Albrecht, the ultimate mold breaker, the man who was ruthlessly efficient, the one general who could possibly reform the army and save the empire, was now on a collision course with the one man who could utterly destroy him, his own sovereign. The simmering, unspoken, and deeply personal rivalry between Archduke Albrecht and Emperor Franz Joseph was not destined to remain a quiet psychological court drama. History would not allow it. An external crisis was brewing that would rip away the polite veneer of familial protocol and expose the rot at the heart of the Habsburg military system. This crisis was the final inevitable showdown for dominance in Central Europe. The clash that had been building since Frederick the Great had stolen Silesia from Maria Theresa a century earlier. This was the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. This 7 weeks' war was not just another border dispute. It was the Kaiserschlacht, the Emperor's Battle, a brutal contest to answer the German question once and for all. Would the future of Germany be united under the liberal, militaristic, and dynamic Protestant Hohenzollerns of Prussia, or would it remain a loose confederation under the ancient Catholic and conservative Habsburgs of Austria? Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian Iron Chancellor, had meticulously engineered this conflict, and he was ready to resolve it with blood and iron. For Franz Joseph, this was an existential war, not just for his influence in Germany, but for the very survival of his multi-ethnic empire. The strategic situation was a nightmare. Austria was caught in a vice, a classic two-front war. Bismarck had skillfully allied with the young Kingdom of Italy, which was hungry to seize the Austrian-controlled province of Venetia. This meant Franz Joseph would have to split his forces. He would have to deploy a main army north into Bohemia to face the primary threat, the technologically superior, brilliantly led Prussian army. And simultaneously, he would have to send a second, smaller army south to the plains of northern Italy to hold off the entire Italian military. This strategic dilemma presented the emperor with a critical, fateful choice. He had 2 armies and 1 brilliant, proven, and visionary general. Where would he place Archduke Albrecht? The logical military answer was obvious. Send your best commander to face your most dangerous enemy. Albrecht, with his reformed tactics, his iron discipline, and his strategic genius, was the only man who stood a chance against the formidable Prussian general staff, led by the legendary Helmuth von Moltke. But in the paranoid, insecure world of the Hofburg, the political answer was very different. Franz Joseph simply could not bring himself to do it. Giving Albrecht command of the main northern army, the Army of Destiny, was too great a risk. What if he won? What if Albrecht, not the emperor, was hailed as the savior of the empire, the man who defeated the Prussian menace? The humiliation of Solferino was still a fresh, stinging wound. The emperor and his personal military clique, the Militärkanzlei led by the influential Count von Crenneville, wanted a commander who was brave, who was popular with the troops, but who was, above all, uncomplicatedly loyal. They wanted a man who would follow orders, who would not question the emperor's authority, and who posed no political threat. They did not want a genius who might overshadow them. They wanted a pliant soldier. And so they made their fateful choice. Archduke Albrecht, the empire's premier strategist, was sent south to Italy to command the smaller, less equipped southern army. It was presented as a vital command, but everyone in the high command knew the truth. It was the secondary front, a holding action. The real war, the war for glory, would be in the north. For that main command, the northern army, Franz Joseph chose General Ludwig von Benedek. On paper, it was a defensible choice. Benedek was a hero, a man of immense personal courage, a Protestant Hungarian who was adored by the common soldiers. He was a brawler, a ferocious tactical commander who had distinguished himself in the bloody street fighting of 1848 and at Solferino itself, where his corps had been one of the few to perform with distinction. But Benedek, for all his bravery, had a terrible secret flaw, a flaw he himself was agonizingly aware of. He was not a strategist. He was a corps commander, a brilliant frontline motivator, but he had no experience maneuvering a vast army of over 200,000 men. He did not understand grand strategy, complex logistics, or the nuances of timing required to counter Moltke's revolutionary tactics. He was, tragically, a man promoted one step too high, a loyal servant being set up for catastrophic failure. He knew it, and he begged the emperor not to give him the command. In a heartbreaking private audience, Benedict reportedly told Franz Joseph, "I must beg your majesty not to do this to me. I do not understand this theater of war. I have no experience in the art of a Feldherr." But his protests were brushed aside. He was loyal, and that was all that mattered. He reluctantly accepted the command, a patriot marching to his own doom. And so, the stage was set for one of the most stunning, tragic, and ironic reversals in military history. In the north, Benedict, the loyal, non-threatening, but strategically out-of-his-depth general, led the magnificent, massive imperial army into Bohemia. He was hesitant, his movements were slow, and he was completely bewildered by the Prussian advance. Moltke's plan was a marvel of modern warfare. He sent 3 separate armies into Austrian territory from different directions, all timed to converge on a single point to annihilate the Austrians in a massive battle of envelopment. Benedict, trained in the old Napoleonic school of a single decisive clash, couldn't comprehend this fluid, multi-pronged assault. More critically, his men were armed with muzzle-loading rifles, which required the soldier to stand up, pour powder down the barrel, and ram a shot home, a process that might allow 2 or 3 shots a minute. The Prussians, by contrast, were armed with the terrifying Zundnadelgewehr, the needle gun, a breech-loading rifle. A Prussian soldier could lie on the ground, reload in seconds, and fire 5 or 6 times in the span. An Austrian fired once. It was a technological massacre. On July 3, 1866, the 2 armies met near the town of Königgrätz. The result was not a battle, it was an apocalypse. Benedict, caught between the Prussian armies, saw his entire force disintegrate. The needle guns tore the Austrian infantry to shreds. The Habsburg artillery, long considered the best in Europe, fought with suicidal bravery but was overwhelmed. By the end of the afternoon, the Imperial Northern Army had ceased to exist. It was one of the most decisive defeats of the 19th century. Tens of thousands of men were killed, wounded, or captured. Benedict, his spirit completely shattered, fled the field. The road to Vienna was now wide open, and the Habsburg Empire, as a great German power, was finished in a single afternoon. It was the ultimate catastrophic failure of Franz Joseph's military system, a humiliation that dwarfed even the disaster at Solferino. The emperor's safe, loyal choice had led the empire to ruin. Now let us pivot. We must rewind the clock just 9 days earlier, to June 24th, 1866. While Benedict was stumbling toward his doom in Bohemia, Archduke Albrecht was in northern Italy, facing the main Italian army near the village of Custozza. The situation was, on paper, perilous. Albrecht was badly outnumbered. The Italian army, led by General La Marmora, was overconfident, convinced that the Austrians were a spent force and eager for a glorious victory to secure Venetia. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They were not fighting Ludwig von Benedict. They were fighting Archduke Albrecht. And Albrecht was operating on the very same ground where his legendary mentor, Field Marshal Radetzky, had won his own famous victories years before. Albrecht knew every hill, every river, every crossroads. More importantly, his troops, the Southern Army, were not the conscripts of the North. They were a lean, hardened, professional force that had been drilled relentlessly in his new methods. They believed in him, they trusted his genius, and they were imbued with his own iron will. The Battle of Custozza was Albrecht's masterpiece. The Italian command was a mess, with rival generals failing to coordinate. Their army advanced in a series of poorly timed, disconnected columns. Albrecht, holding the strong central high ground, watched them come. And then with the decisive cold precision of a surgeon, he struck. He did not passively defend, he attacked. He used his interior lines to shuttle his troops, concentrating overwhelming force against one Italian column at a time, shattering it before turning his attention to the next. It was a textbook display of modern maneuver warfare, the very kind of war he had been preaching for years. He was everywhere, personally directing artillery, shoring up infantry lines, and at the critical moment leading a massive cavalry charge that broke the Italian center. Unlike the distant, confused Benedek, Albrecht was a visible, inspiring, and utterly dominant force on the battlefield. By the end of the day, the numerically superior Italian army was not just defeated, it was routed. They fled back across the Mincio River in a state of total panic and disarray. Albrecht had won a stunning, total, and unambiguous victory. He had crushed Austria's southern enemy in a single brilliant day. The news from the two fronts arrived in Vienna almost simultaneously, creating a sense of surreal national whiplash. From the south came the triumphant telegram: Albrecht, the hero, had won. The hero of Kustoza had upheld the honor of Austrian arms. The empire rejoiced, and then like a thunderclap came the apocalyptic dispatch from the north. Benedek was destroyed, the army was gone, and the Prussians were marching on the capital. The irony was so cruel, so profound, it was almost unbelievable. Albrecht's brilliant victory, the greatest Austrian military triumph in a generation, was rendered strategically meaningless. He had won his war, but the empire had lost the war. The primary front had collapsed so completely that Albrecht's southern victory was nothing more than a footnote to a disaster. The war was over. Prussia had won. Austria, defeated and humiliated, was forced to sign the Peace of Prague, formally dissolving the German Confederation and expelling the Habsburgs from German affairs forever. The empire was also forced to cede Venetia to Italy, meaning Albrecht had defeated the Italians for nothing. In the immediate panicked aftermath of Königgrätz, with the Prussians bearing down on an undefended Vienna, Franz Joseph did the only thing he could. In a moment of supreme, agonizing humiliation, he was forced to send a desperate telegram to the one man he had so deliberately sidelined. He effectively begged Archduke Albrecht to leave his victorious army in Italy, come north immediately, and take supreme command of all remaining military forces, a shattered, demoralized, and broken remnant, to scrape together a last-ditch defense of the capital itself. Albrecht, ever the consummate professional, obeyed. He left his triumphant army and raced north, but by the time he arrived, the political reality was clear. The war was lost, and all he could do was preside over its formal military conclusion. But in this act, a new reality was forged. Franz Joseph, by public decree, had been forced to name Albrecht the Armeeoberkommandant, the supreme commander of the entire imperial and royal army. This was the peak. This was Albrecht's moment of ultimate tragic vindication. He had been proven right, his methods were right, his vision was right, his warnings about the army's stagnation were right, his victory at Kustoza was a blinding beacon of competence in a sea of imperial failure. He was, without question, the most respected, most celebrated, and now most powerful man in the Habsburg Empire, second only to the emperor himself. He was the hero of Kustoza, the savior of the army's honor, the last great general of his house. And as he stood at this zenith, publicly lauded and officially promoted, Albrecht must have known, with the cold certainty of a strategist, that he had just signed his own political death warrant. He was no longer just a potential rival to his insecure cousin. He was a living, breathing public rebuke. He was the man who had succeeded where the emperor's system had failed. And for a paranoid ruler like Franz Joseph, that was not a strength to be utilized, but an unforgivable sin that, sooner or later, would have to be punished. This, then, was the central corrosive paradox of Archduke Albrecht's life. He stood at the absolute zenith of his public career, having been granted the supreme command he had always deserved. Yet, he had never been more isolated, more distrusted, or, in a political sense, more vulnerable. His very success was his greatest liability. He could command armies, but he could not command the one thing he truly needed: the emperor's trust. His victories, his competence, his entire public persona served only to amplify his personal and political isolation. In the wake of Königgrätz, Franz Joseph's paranoia, once a festering private insecurity, now hardened into a cold, pragmatic political calculus. The emperor, having been so profoundly and publicly humiliated, now looked at his cousin and saw not a potential savior, but a living judgment. Albrecht's mere presence in a room, his silent, grim professionalism, was a constant, stinging reminder of the emperor's own catastrophic failure at Solferino and his disastrous misjudgment of Benedek. Franz Joseph, for the sake of his own survival and the preservation of his dynasty, knew two things with absolute certainty. First, the empire must be radically restructured to survive, and second, that restructuring must result in the neutralization of Archduke Albrecht. The catastrophe of 1866 was so total, so apocalyptic, that it shattered the old system of Habsburg absolutism forever. Franz Joseph, a natural autocrat, was forced by the sheer brutal reality of his defeat to pivot. He was a pragmatist above all else, and he recognized that he could no longer rule 50 million subjects from Vienna by decree, especially with Prussia dominant in Germany and Russia looming in the east. He had to make peace not just with his external enemies, but with his internal ones. The most powerful and restless of these internal forces were the Hungarians, who had been brutally suppressed since 1849, a suppression, incidentally, that Albrecht himself had overseen as military governor. The Hungarians, led by the shrewd and moderate statesman Ferenc Deák, saw their opportunity. In the empire's moment of supreme weakness, they negotiated not as defeated subjects, but as equal partners. The result, hammered out with astonishing speed, was the Ausgleich of 1867, the great Austro-Hungarian Compromise. This single act of political desperation would define the empire's final half-century, and it would become the very tool Franz Joseph used to politically dismantle his troublesome cousin. The Ausgleich was a brilliant, pragmatic, and deeply cynical piece of statecraft. It split the empire in two, creating the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. Franz Joseph would be Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. The Hungarians would get their own constitution, their own parliament, their own prime minister, and near total control over their own internal affairs. The empire would now be joined only by a shared monarch, a shared foreign policy, a shared ministry of finance for those common affairs, and, most critically, a common army. And here, in the fine print of military organization, was the poison pill intended for Albrecht. For Franz Joseph, the Ausgleich solved his greatest political problem, but it also, quite beautifully, solved his greatest personal problem. It created an entirely new political structure that would automatically check, balance, and ultimately cripple the centralized power that Albrecht championed. This brings us to the fatal flaw that would seal Albrecht's fate. His flaw was not a personal vice like a love of gambling or drink. His flaw was his own unbending, iron-willed integrity. Albrecht was a man of a single, indivisible idea, the Gesamtmonarchie, the total monarchy. He was an arch-conservative, a true believer in a unified, centralized, German-speaking empire. He had spent his entire life working to build a single, unified, German-speaking army as the steel spine that would hold this fragile, multi-ethnic body together. And now he watched in horror as his emperor, in what Albrecht saw as an act of suicidal political cowardice, deliberately sawed that spine in half. He loathed the Ausgleich. He saw it, correctly from a purely military standpoint, as an unmitigated disaster. He argued against it, fiercely and vocally, in memorandums, at court, and in every council of state. He warned Franz Joseph, in blunt, undiplomatic terms, that splitting the army's command and budget between Vienna and Budapest would render it permanently dysfunctional. He predicted that allowing the Hungarians to create their own separate territorial army would create a rival force that would bleed the common army of resources and loyalty. He foresaw a future of endless, paralyzing political squabbles over recruitment, language, and funding that would make any future mobilization a bureaucratic nightmare. He was, in every single technical prediction, absolutely correct. But this very correctness was his undoing. While Albrecht was arguing from the cold, hard logic of a general, Franz Joseph was operating on the fluid, murky logic of a politician. The emperor didn't care if the compromise was militarily inefficient. He needed it for political survival. Albrecht's rigid, principled opposition was, for Franz Joseph, a godsend. It allowed the emperor to reframe his personal, paranoid sidelining of Albrecht as a necessary, responsible act of state. Albrecht was no longer just the popular general who made the emperor feel insecure. He was now the reactionary fossil, the unbending absolutist, the grim old conservative who was blocking the empire's only viable path forward. His personal jealousy could now be laundered through the mechanisms of political necessity. Albrecht, the brilliant modernizer of tactics and technology, had tragically chained himself to a completely antiquated political ideology, and Franz Joseph had just handed him the key to his own cell. This unbending political rigidity was mirrored and perhaps tragically amplified by the private agonies that had hollowed him out. Albrecht was not just a stern commander, he was a man broken by grief. His personal life had been a landscape of relentless sorrow. In 1864, just 2 years before his great victory at Custozza, his beloved wife, Archduchess Hildegard of Bavaria, had died a miserable death from pleurisy and tuberculosis, contracted after she caught a chill at a ball. Her death left him alone, a single father to 3 small children. Then the fates twisted the knife. His only son and heir, Karl, a boy in whom he had placed all his dynastic hopes, died in childhood from smallpox. But the most horrific, operatic tragedy was the death of his eldest daughter, Matilde. In 1867, the very year of the Ausgleich that was destroying his political world, the 18-year-old Archduchess was preparing for a gala. She was wearing a new ball gown, and, against the rules of the house, she lit a cigarette. When her father, Albrecht, suddenly entered the room, she reflexively hid the cigarette behind her back, instantly igniting the highly flammable, glycerin-treated tulle of her dress. She went up in flames before his very eyes. She survived for weeks, suffering agonizing, untreatable burns, and finally died, leaving Albrecht utterly bereft. These losses did not soften him. They did not make him more pliable or philosophical. They calcified him. They burned away whatever reserves of compromise or gentleness he might have possessed, leaving only a bitter, ironclad sense of duty. He was a man who had lost his wife, his son, and his daughter. The army was all he had left. The unified, indivisible, common army was his last child, his last legacy. And now he was being forced to watch as his own cousin, the emperor, dismembered it right in front of him. This created the ticking bomb that would inevitably destroy his career. Franz Joseph's fear of Albrecht's influence, now compounded by Albrecht's vocal opposition to the new order, led to a systematic, insidious campaign of marginalization. This was the betrayal, the kin-crushing act, not a dramatic public execution, but a slow, bureaucratic strangulation. The Ausgleich was the perfect weapon. With the creation of the dual monarchy, Albrecht's grand title of Armee Oberkommandant was quietly allowed to lapse. It was replaced with a new, far more constrained position, Inspector General of the Army. On paper, it was still the highest military post. He was responsible for training, doctrine, and readiness, but in reality, his power was systematically hollowed out. The Ausgleich created not one, but three armies: the Common Army, the Austrian Territorial Army, and the Hungarian Territorial Army. It also created three ministries of war. Albrecht, as Inspector General, had theoretical oversight of the Common Army, but he had almost no authority over the two territorial forces, and most critically, he had no control over the budget. His role was to inspect and advise an army whose funding, recruitment, and even language of command were now subject to the whims of two separate and often hostile parliaments in Vienna and Budapest. This was Franz Joseph's quiet, devastating masterstroke. He had effectively trapped his brilliant general in a gilded cage. He had turned Albrecht from a commander into a committee chairman. For the next 30 years, Albrecht, the decisive victor of Kustoza, the man who understood modern warfare better than anyone in the empire, was forced to spend his days fighting not Prussians or Italians, but politicians, bureaucrats, and Hungarian deputies. He fought endless, losing battles over the adoption of new rifles, the funding for modern artillery, and, most bitterly, the language question, as Hungarian politicians relentlessly tried to replace German with Magyar as the language of command in their regiments. Every proposal for reform, every request for funds, every attempt to create the unified modern force he had dreamed of was now dragged through a political swamp, deliberately designed to frustrate him. He was the empire's military titan, and he had been relegated to the role of a glorified and deeply resentful quartermaster. His victories had become utterly Pyrrhic. His triumph at Kustoza had won him nothing but a bigger, more ornate prison. He had gained the supreme title, but it cost him all his autonomy, and in the process condemned the empire's army to the very paralysis and weakness he had spent his life trying to prevent. The emperor, driven by fear, had successfully crushed his own kin, using not a sword, but a pen. And so, Archduke Albrecht, the victor of Custozza, the man who held the supreme command in his hands for one brief, shining, necessary moment, began the long, slow, agonizing final act of his life. For nearly 30 years, from 1867 until his death in 1895, he held the prestigious, opulent, and utterly hollow title of Inspector General. He was, by every outward measure, one of the most powerful men in Europe. He was the highest-ranking soldier in the empire. He was also, thanks to his inheritance as Duke of Teschen, fabulously, almost unimaginably wealthy, one of the richest men in the entire monarchy, with vast estates, palaces, and art collections. He was a living legend, the son of the great Archduke Charles, a man deferred to, bowed to, and universally respected. And it was all a magnificent, soul-crushing lie. His life became a bitter, Sisyphean routine. He was a general with no army to command, a reformer with no power to reform. He would spend his days in his palatial Vienna residence, the Palais Albrecht, conducting inspections, reviewing troops, and most agonizingly, writing memos. He wrote thousands of them, meticulous, detailed, brilliantly argued, and utterly ignored memorandums. He wrote memos on the urgent need for a unified railway system for rapid mobilization. He wrote memos on the critical danger of the Hungarian parliament's refusal to fund modern artillery. He wrote memos on the strategic insanity of allowing two separate, rival territorial armies to bleed the common army of the best recruits. He wrote memos on the need for standardized training, for a merit-based promotion system, for a general staff that was actually empowered to make strategic decisions. He was, in effect, a Cassandra in a field marshal's uniform, shouting warnings into a void of political calculation and bureaucratic indifference. Each memo would be politely received by the War Ministry, acknowledged with deep respect by the Emperor himself, and then quietly, effectively, buried under the political squabbles of the dual monarchy. The Hungarian politicians in Budapest, who now held the power of the purse, saw every one of Albrecht's memos as exactly what it was, an attempt to roll back their newfound autonomy, a power grab by the old German-speaking centralist guard in Vienna. They blocked his reforms at every turn, not because they were bad military ideas, but precisely because they were good military ideas that would have strengthened the common imperial structure they so deeply distrusted. Franz Joseph, for his part, played the role of the beleaguered monarch to perfection. He would meet with Albrecht, listen patiently to his cousin's grim, frustrated prophecies, nod sympathetically, and then explain, with a sigh of deep regret, that his hands were tied. The Hungarian parliament was being difficult. The liberals in the Austrian parliament were demanding budget cuts. Politics, you see. It was a masterful, passive-aggressive performance that would continue for decades. He had successfully trapped his brilliant cousin in a bureaucratic spiderweb of his own design. Albrecht was left to pace the gilded cage he had been given. He was a man of action, of decisive, brutal efficiency, forced to live a life of committee meetings and polite, toothless debate. He watched year after year as the army he had tried to forge into a modern weapon was starved of funds, fractured by language politics, and compromised at every level by the very Ausgleich he had warned against. His bitterness became legendary. He was a grim, unsmiling, almost spectral figure at court, a living monument to a bygone era of imperial authority, a constant, uncomfortable reminder of the empire's great what if. He was the Titan, chained to a rock, while the vultures of parliamentary politics pecked at the army, the very thing he had given his life to protect. His final years were spent in this state of magnificent, wealthy, and profound isolation. The man who had been defined by the roar of the battlefield was now surrounded by the quiet ticking of clocks in his opulent, silent palaces. He was the very picture of the eminence grise, the old warrior, revered but irrelevant. When he died in 1895 at the age of 77, it was not the dramatic, thunderous end of a battlefield titan. It was the quiet, predictable passing of an old, tired, and deeply frustrated man. The empire, of course, put on a spectacular show. His state funeral was one of the grandest Vienna had ever seen, a massive, somber outpouring of imperial pomp. Soldiers from every regiment he had ever commanded from every corner of the vast, fragmenting empire, marched in his honor. The emperor himself, Franz Joseph, now a gray-bearded patriarch of 65, walked in the procession, his face a mask of solemn imperial grief. The monarchy mourned the passing of a symbol, the son of the victor of Aspern, the hero of Kustoza, the last great paladin of the old empire. And yet one cannot help but imagine the quiet private thoughts of the emperor as he watched his cousin's casket being lowered into the imperial crypt. It must have been a complex, chilling cocktail of emotions, a genuine familial sorrow, perhaps a flicker of old guilt, but beneath it all, a cold, unmistakable and profound sense of relief. The great rival, the living judgment, the man who had been right when he had been so wrong, was finally, permanently gone. The long 77-year shadow had been lifted. The immediate chaos that Albrecht's death unleashed was not loud, but it was deep. Just as he had predicted, his passing left a profound power vacuum, not just in title, but in authority. There was no one left in the empire who could speak with his gravitas. He was replaced, eventually, by his own adopted son and heir, Archduke Friedrich, a competent but far less forceful man. But the real change was political. Albrecht, for all his frustrations, had been the conservative anchor, the unshakable iron pillar of the old unified army. Even in his powerlessness, his sheer moral presence had been enough to slow down the most radical demands of the Hungarian nationalists. With him gone, that final break was removed. Franz Joseph, now old and increasingly weary of the endless political strife, found himself facing an ever more aggressive Hungarian parliament, which now relentlessly pushed its advantage. The demands for more control over the army, for the use of the Magyar language, for a completely separate military identity, grew louder and more insistent. The emperor, with no great military counter-authority to hide behind, was forced into a policy of muddling through, making concession after concession, just to keep the fragile Ausgleich from shattering. The slow erosion of the common army that Albrecht had fought against now accelerated, unchecked. The very fragmentation he had spent his life warning against became the undisputed reality of the empire. Archduke Albrecht's long, frustrated life had come to an end, but the catastrophic failure he predicted was only just beginning. His story's true, devastating meaning is found not in the victory at Custozza, but in the ashes of 1918. To understand the true tragic consequence of Franz Joseph's fear, we must fast forward just 19 years from Albrecht's death to the summer of 1914. When the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, another fiery, centralizing reformer who also clashed with the ancient emperor, was assassinated in Sarajevo, the dual monarchy lurched into war. And the army that marched off to fight that war, the army that would bleed to death in the fields of Galicia and the frozen passes of the Carpathians, was not the army Albrecht had wanted to build. It was the army he had been forced to accept. It was the direct, catastrophic result of his 30-year-long political neutralization. The weaknesses he had spent 3 decades identifying in his ignored memos were not just theoretical. They became the horrifying, practical reality that consumed millions of lives. The army that collapsed in World War I was an organization precisely defined by the flaws he had fought. He had warned of ethnic fragmentation. In 1914, this became a logistical and moral nightmare. Czech soldiers shipped off to fight their Slavic brothers, the Russians, surrendered in entire regiments. Officers shouted commands in German to Hungarian, Polish, and Croatian troops, who often didn't understand them or worse, simply refused to obey. This was the language question he had so bitterly fought, now exploding in the face of battle. He had warned of underfunding and political paralysis. In 1914, this meant that Austrian artillery units were rationed to firing just a handful of shells a day, while their enemies blanketed them with modern firepower. It meant that soldiers were sent to fight in the brutal Carpathian winter in boots with cardboard soles, because the Viennese and Hungarian parliaments could not agree on funding. It meant that the army's chief of staff, Konrad von Hötzendorf, a man who embodied the reckless, offensive will to power that was the very antithesis of Albrecht's cold, defensive, logistical professionalism, launched a series of suicidal, unsupported offensives that effectively destroyed the Army's entire pre-war professional officer corps in the first 6 months. Albrecht, the master of the calculated defense at Kustoza, would have watched in horror as Conrad threw away the empire's entire future on a desperate, romantic gamble. The army he had tried to make into a modern professional shield for the dynasty was instead a broken, dysfunctional, multilingual, and poorly equipped rabble, destined to shatter at the first hard contact. So we return to our original haunting question. Why did a seemingly powerful empire beset by enemies deliberately crush its own greatest general? The answer is as simple as human and as tragic as the story itself. Archduke Albrecht was the general the emperor feared because he was a living, breathing, unblinking mirror. He was everything Franz Joseph was not: a proven battlefield commander, a man of unbending, decisive action, a true military genius. His competence turned from asset into archenemy. His loyalty became the very burden he had sworn to bear. In the end, Franz Joseph won the personal, decades-long duel. He outlived his rival. He died in his own bed in 1916, still Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, having successfully held his fragile, mosaic-like empire together for nearly 68 years. But in winning this petty personal battle of wills, he ensured that the empire would lose the Great War for its survival. By choosing to neutralize his most capable defender, by sacrificing military reality on the altar of his own personal envy, Franz Joseph didn't save his dynasty. He merely guaranteed its annihilation just a few years after his own death. The story of Archduke Albrecht is not just the tragedy of a great man denied his destiny. It is the story of the Habsburg Empire itself in microcosm, a story of brilliant potential, of paralyzing insecurity, and of a fatal, tragic refusal to change until it was far, far too late. He might have been the savior, but paradoxically, he became the man they dared not empower.